Thank you and welcome everyone. Let me send you a warm welcome here from Costa Rica, where I am at the Earth Charter International in our education center. We have an Earth Charter Education Center here focused on education for sustainable development that is located on the campus of the University for Peace. And we are organizing this series of masterclasses as part of our UNESCO chair. We have created 10 years ago a UNESCO chair on education for sustainable development with the Earth Charter, which has a specific focus on research, training, education, on that intersection between sustainability, values, and education. And we often ask ourselves the question of how can we really generate transformative learning through values-based education, and using the Earth Charter as our ethical reference for that and tool. So for this year, we have created this series of masterclasses, which basically is 10 masterclasses in English, 10 masterclasses in Spanish and in Portuguese that are running from between February and November this year. And today I'm very honored to welcome two giant women, I would say, Scilla Elworthy and Karen Lee Downs, who are going to offer us a wonderful masterclass on feminine intelligence, building a collaborative, compassionate, and safer world. I'm very actually happy because this is a subject that has been specifically in the last year very much in my mind regarding the role of women or the feminine intelligence that we can use that sometimes is not so well empowered, even in our mindsets, in our psyche, in our worldviews. So I have been looking forward for this masterclass, even for myself, in terms of a learning experience. How can I expand my vision and my consciousness with regards to all of these things? So I am going to invite you to start introducing yourselves in the chat box with your name, if you can, and where you are, because it's always good to see who is in the room with us. So if I can welcome all of you from different parts of the world, and I know you're located in different countries, but it would be nice to start getting to know who is in the room, which country you are, or maybe even the organization if you want, that you're working on. So I'm pleased to introduce you to Scilla Elworthy, who is here with us, joining us from the UK. Scilla is the founder of the Business Plan for Peace. She received a number of different prizes, including the Luxembourg Peace Prize in 2020. She's the author of many books, 10 books, but the latest one is called The Mighty Heart in Action. She also has a very, very interesting other book called The Business Plan for Peace, Building a World Without War. And I think we could have different masterclasses with Scilla just on the different books she has. Karen Downs is here in Costa Rica, and she has been working in many different themes, including human flourishing, grace and resilience, ethical leadership, community building, society and systemic change, and something that is very much part of my own area of interest is how can we elevate our consciousness. I'm very interested in the skills and knowledge of Karen with regards to ethical leadership and this notion of the feminine intelligence. I think today I'm looking forward, Karen, to listen to you because I think you're going to share with us more about the feminine principles. So with that, I would like to split the group. I'm going to ask Ariana to help us do a very quick breakout rooms with groups of 3 And the purpose of that is just to invite you to get to know one another and just to share who you are, where you are, and what is the interest that brings you here into this session today. What are the questions, curiosity you have on the feminine intelligence and in listening to these two powerful giant women that we are bringing here today. So it's a quick, what we call speed networking meeting, 3 minutes, and we'll come back to the plenary. Is that okay? Okay, so let's go ahead, Ariana. And I'll see you here in 3 minutes. I just want to acknowledge that we have people from Latin America, from Africa, from Europe and North America who are joining us today. And I really want to express my appreciation and gratitude for all of you. I'm looking forward to pass the mic to Karen Dons, but I just want to share with you that one of our expectations in this session is, in this time together, is to discover more or reflect on how can we better understand the feminine intelligence. What does it really mean, and how can we make use of it or expand on it? How can we access the feminine intelligence, seeing the world with new eyes through those lenses? And why embodying and leading with feminine intelligence can transform the challenges we face and can help us transform the challenges we face. And the last point that we are looking forward in terms of how this session will help us expand our understanding on this is how to practice the skills that are useful to address our most pressing issues using those lenses. So with this, I'm happy to invite Karen, please, to take the floor. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And it's such an important time in our lives, in our world. And there's so much going on in our world and so much available online. So I just want to honor everyone and say my gratitude for showing up for this conversation. It's an important one to both Scilla and I. We've been friends, deep collaborative friends, colleagues, and sisters on the path for some years now. And I wanted to start out by saying a little bit. I'm going to speak for just a couple of moments, and then I'm going to ask Scilla to share her story of how she arrived in this conversation at this point in time to have this conversation with you, and I'll share my own background. But it's not about sharing our backgrounds, it's about sharing our deep experiences of what moved us, what touched us, what activated us to be activists and change makers, thought leaders out in the world. Put ourselves sometimes at risk, put ourselves sometimes in places of vulnerability and exposure and judgment, and so many of those things that can come at one when they stand tall in their agency and stand for what they believe in. So really, thanks for being here, my partner Scilla. And I just want to begin by saying that FemmeQ, which is an organisation that Scilla and I co-founded, started back in 2015. And the reason that we sat down together is that Scilla had already an organisation called Women Rising World. Scilla and I became part of that organisation, working by Scilla's side. And what we saw happening is that every time we mentioned the word women, someone would have a conversation with us about the gender issue and equality and feminism. And we thought to ourselves, but what is missing? Really, if we really look, there's something else going on that isn't being spoken about. We're not accessing something in the realm of transformation and shifting consciousness that's needed, because it's not about policies and getting people equal. Just about all of the pieces are important, but it's not just about equality, parity, and women having their seat at the table. What about the men that had been told for decades, centuries, they're in Scilla's world, sent off to war, in the business world, in my world, they've been told, grow up and grow some. Where was the opportunity to experience the deep felt experiences of their lives, of their emotions, fully integrated into their body? And we started calling this the feminine aspects of the human psyche or the human being. So I know for everyone that's on the call today, and that's what we're going to explore today, why we began, and we're both going to share our stories of what was important to us to bring this alive and bring this forward. But what's important in the call today is that if you look up the word feminine in the dictionary, I don't even know what that says. But what I do know it doesn't explain is what goes on in our bodies, in our psyches, in our somatic intelligence, in our sensory experiences, in our ancestry, lineage, and history that explains who we are and why we do what we do. More an ontological question than a definition. Because if we stuck to the definition, all of us on the call have got very different experiences of what the feminine is and what it means to us. So my invitation as you start to listen to Scilla speak and about her experience and what brings her to this important conversation, I really ask you to listen with a generosity of listening. Open your hearts and minds to not whether you agree with what Scilla and I are saying today, but is something new showing up for you that you haven't heard before, hadn't considered before. And it's in the realm of curiosity and wonder that we start to really listen to one another versus judge one another, because maybe we don't know yet fully what the feminine means and if it was unleashed in the world and ran all of our social systems. Maybe we don't know yet. So it is a mystery and it's magical and it's divine, but let's see what we can hear today and what we can experience afresh. So hand over to you, Scilla, please, your story of how we came to be here together. And much more than that.
Thanks, Karen. And it's a joy to see all of you joining this masterclass, particularly some old friends. So hello to everybody. To answer Karen's question, I was one of the lucky ones because I had no choice as to what I was to do with my life. At the age of 13, I was watching a grainy old black and white TV in my parents' living room, and I saw tanks charging into Budapest in Hungary, mowing down teenagers not very much older than me. And I was absolutely horrified and shocked by the violence. And I rushed upstairs and started packing my suitcase. And my mum came up and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm going to Budapest." I had no idea where Budapest was. And she said, "What for?" And I said, "There's something so horrible happening there. I have to go now." And she said, "Don't be so silly." And I burst into tears. And she got it, bless her. She understood. She said, "Okay, I see that this is really important, but you're far too young to be used to anybody in conflict situations. And if you'll just unpack your suitcase, I will see to it that you get trained." And she did. She sent me off age 16 to work in a holiday home for concentration camp survivors. And I spent all summer peeling potatoes and listening to people who'd been in Auschwitz and the experience they'd had and seeing who they were and what they'd suffered. And then I took myself off and went and worked in refugee camps for Vietnamese refugees. And I worked in it was a nursery really for orphans in Algeria at the end of the Algerian War. I wasn't able to speak any Arabic, but we just, as you do with children, we just communicated. And then I found myself after a while in Africa, and I spent 10 years working in different parts of Africa. But long story short, I worked for a while for UNESCO, who Marianne mentioned, in Paris, actually. I wrote their first report on women's role in bringing about peaceful settlement of violent conflict. I worked with 7 other women from all over the planet, and we put case studies together. I think it was the first ever way this was done. I did it for the Minority Rights Group and UNESCO, and we aired it at the UNESCO conference, and it must have been 1982. So that takes us back a bit, when such things weren't really normal at all, that you would think about women's role in in addressing conflict effectively, and how women do that. So I'll just, I won't take up too much time, but I'll just fast forward to when I was working with Nelson Mandela and Richard Branson and Peter Gabriel, setting up a group called the Elders. It was Peter Gabriel's idea. And he said, the world is now a global village and it needs global elders to help it make the right decisions, or at least better decisions. And
Scilla, we've lost you.
Your mic got disconnected. Coming back. Yes, I think you're back.
Am I back? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, just to conclude the story, that the first time I met Nelson Mandela, he was 89 already, and he walked into the room leaning heavily on Peter Gabriel's arm, and he started to talk, and I got goosebumps. And he's not an orator. He doesn't do oratorical flourishes, and he's got a raspy voice. But 25 minutes later, when he finished speaking, I still had goosebumps. And I asked myself, what's this? What's going on? What is it? And it took me a little while to figure out that what I was encountering was the sheer energy of Mandela's integrity. Here was a person, a human being, that you could not push around. He was clear. He'd spent 27 years on Robben Island working out how to deal with violence from the warders, from the situation, from the South African government. And this man had managed to produce in one human being a clarity and a look. When you looked in his eyes, you thought he could stop a tank with that expression on his face. And that's where I want to come to in our discussion today, as to how the feminine intelligence can actually stop tanks and stop war. So I'll pass now to Karen.
Thank you, Scilla.
Let's hear about your story, Karen.
Thank you. It wasn't the story that I was going to tell today, but I was sitting in a sound. I'm here in Costa Rica, so I'm having, I've done a big transformation in my life with uprooting my life in England and now living in Costa Rica, which I love. And I was in a sound bowl healing the other night, and this image came to me that I remembered what was my first stirring of the feminine. And my daughter, I had studied Rudolf Steiner's work for years as in my early 20s, which was very unusual just to take on those spiritual studies in anthroposophy back then. And my daughter went to the Steiner school. And when she started kindergarten on her first day, it was a very, very hot day in the playground out in the back garden. And the sprinkler was on in Australia. And the sprinkler's going backwards and forwards. And the little boys in the playground threw off their shirts and started running under the sprinkler. And my daughter thought, what a good idea. So she threw off her dress, handed it to me, and ran to the sprinkler to join the little boys. And the little boys turned, pointed their finger at her, laughing at her bare chest. She looked down at her body, ran back to me and got her dress. And I went, right, okay. Now she's got a different relationship to her body and who she is in the world. That was shocking to me. So I think at that moment I went, I need to do something about this. This isn't okay with me. So how do we change that perception, and how do we not have women be, or young girls be, humiliated about their bodies? I had an aromatherapy company at the time, and so I was working with and training thousands of women, as it turned out, over 13 years, to honor their body as a sacred temple and anoint their body. So we would tell stories about Cleopatra anointing her body, loving her body. And so this notion of aromatherapy as a therapy started to permeate through the Australian culture. We wrote 6 books, we ran workshops, and I was working with women for 13 years, but we also got it approved by the government as a therapeutic substance. So we went into hospitals in palliative care. We went into drug rehabilitation clinics where we used smell and touch to rehabilitate people's self-esteem and confidence. So during that time that I was working with oils, I was empowering women, having women be their self-healers, that they didn't need the traditional or the allopathic medicines, but they could go back to traditional medicines, was something that I loved and was very dear. And then one day someone said to me, "It's all very nice what you're doing in Australia, Karen, but what about your global sisters?" It's like, my who? My global sisters. So I would have been 28 at the time. I'd already had my business. I started my business very young, and we were very successful in the Western context. And so I packed my bags 1 week later and flew to New York to join an organization called the Hunger Project. And the reason I went is because I found out that the chronic persistence of hunger has nothing to do with food. Famine requires food. But the chronic persistence of hunger is a systemic societal problem. And what the Hunger Project had researched was that the cause of the chronic persistence of hunger was the subjugation and marginalization of women. If women are not flourishing in a community, the community does not flourish. If women are not given their agency, their sovereignty, their right to money, their right to safety, then the community suffers and the systemic problem continues. And so for 5 years, I went to India and Bangladesh to sit in the village with those women as my sisters. And we would run workshops called Vision, Commitment and Action. Those women who were sold off as child brides or put into rape camps had no vision for their future. They could hardly walk, let alone have a vision or a possibility of a new future. But what was established is that those women, this is where I got in touch with feminine intelligence, those women rallied together, they backed each other, they supported one another, and they held their men accountable for the drinking of alcohol, the use of money in things that did not serve the community, like building bridges or roads when they had no clean water or toilets. And so that shift started to happen with women standing up and saying, we want a future for our children, we want to care for our community, and we want to care for you. We want a flourishing future. They wouldn't have used those words, I'm paraphrasing, but those women started to step up and have take control, buy their own land, apply for loans, and so could have their autonomy to an extent in their lives. Now, those systemic problems haven't gone away, they still continue. But if I come fast forward into moving into when I moved to England, after I left Australia and moved to England, I sold my company, moved to England and started working in transformational leadership. I went from, this was an amazing contrast for me, I went from a company that worked with essential oils out of plants, into the most toxic masculine environments, oils out of the ground. So I was working for BHP Billiton, BP Oil and Gas, and I'd gone from 13 years of working with all women, building a company based on the feminine principles where we would meditate every morning, we would light vaporizers, we would take care of one another, into very toxic environments where all that mattered was the extraction out of the ground, resources taken from our Mother Earth, and profit. No care for the people, no care for the planet, just profit to the shareholders. So for me, I think today is and why I created my organization, my consulting business called the Flourish Initiative, is that it takes initiative to flourish. We humans need to take that agency, take our initiative to have a future that we're interested or vested in or we yearn for. So I've had the experience of having these extremes of working in the global south, working in the corporate boardrooms, and seeing the contrast of where the feminine, where people-centric, where collaboration, consideration, compassion, as well as profit is combined, versus the lack of respect, regard for people or planet in many of those toxic environments I worked in. I ended up having a nervous breakdown. And that was my sign, where I couldn't force, I couldn't push, I couldn't say, because my words didn't land in that environment for transformation. There was no interest in most of those organizations. I thought I could go in and produce a change, but it was pointless. So after I suffered, I thought, that's it, I'm done with the environment. However, now we're right back in the thick of it, all of us, because that environment has to be transformed. So here I am knowing, feeling, experiencing, as Scilla has, how critical the feminine intelligence, the feminine principle is critical for our survival. So thank you for that.
So Karen, I would like to ask, what are the feminine principles? Are you going to, well, before that, thank you both of you for sharing your stories and how a little bit your journey, you know, the important elements that have shaped your lives in terms of where you are now today. It's incredible stories that you both have together. It's incredibly inspiring. And of course, that has shaped where you are now. Karen or Scilla, would you share with us what are these feminine intelligence principles?
I think if it's okay, Miriam, I'd like to pause on the answer to the question just now, because I think as we unfold, my feeling is sometimes if we get to principles too quickly, people are ticking it off as information. Oh, this is what I have to do. Versus deepening, if we deepen our connection to one another and open our hearts, continue to open our inquiry and our hearts into this mystery, into what in life, how have I experienced the feminine or how have I not?
Sure.
Because for me, and I know Scilla's background with Scilla, your very strong male family, all your brothers and such a strong masculine influence. And my father, very strong male. I've had a lot of work to do on transforming that, how I had to survive my family, which was to be masculine. So I'd like to delve a little bit more into the conversation before we share that, if that's okay, Mary. And I'd like to share my screen.
Sure.
And then we can go to a breakout. Can everyone see my screen? Is that?
Yes. Yeah.
Yep. Great.
But maybe you can do yes. Perfect.
So for the last 6 years, as we mentioned at the beginning, when we started 7 years now, when we launched and started the conversation about FemmeQ, it's evolved in many different facets. So Miriam, you were part of our FemmeQ Summit last year here in Costa Rica, which was an amazing event, 28 speakers, and Scilla came in from the UK to be with us. This is something that I've arrived at, and it's not a definition, it's simply how I have experienced and what I now say is my stand for the feminine. So I'm just going to read it out, and if everyone reads along with me. So firstly, it's a feminine intelligence. It's a shift in consciousness that is key to our survival. Feminine intelligence is a deep knowing that we are all part of a living system, of a living universe, an innate sense of responsibility for the survival of human and planetary life. The embodiment of feminine intelligence brings the concentration of love, energy, and life force to someone or something that is of the greatest importance beyond self-interest. And I think in Scilla's story, she just demonstrated that. Her heart was broken open when she saw that visual on the screen. So I want to pause there for a moment just to consider these words and ask everyone for a moment to think about what strikes you, what's meaningful to you, what's important to you about any of those words there. What touches your heart? versus whether you agree or disagree with it. What words touch your heart? What speaks to you? And then, if I can, I'd like us to do a breakout and ask questions. So I will share the screen again because I have the questions up on the screen. Miriam, you might, I don't know if you can put them into the chat.
So I think our program needs me to actually respond to the comments you've made, because what I wanted to talk about was what I call right brain intelligence. And I found in working a lot with men in major decision-making positions, whether in the work we did with nuclear weapons policymakers for 20 years and getting them to listen to one another, and most of them were male. And when we were able to have quiet moment, I'll tell you a story that'll illustrate it better. We had a delegation to Oxford, and there they met.
Scilla, your microphone got disconnected, I think.
That's very hard. Let me just.
Now it's back.
Okay. This was a conference in an Oxford college, and the Chinese were meeting their British and American colleagues. And the air got quite heated because they disagreed very strongly on the questions of proliferation of nuclear weapons. And I was in the chair, and I realized that this was just becoming an argument. And so I wanted to change the atmosphere. So I just intervened and I said, gentlemen, what we're hearing is very important, very essential information, and we need to digest it and not just crash straight on. So we're now going to have 3 minutes of complete silence while we simply digest what's been said. And somewhat to my surprise and delight, that's exactly what happened. You could have heard a pin drop. There was complete silence in the room, and everything changed during that silence. And when we resumed 3 minutes later, the conversation was completely different, because we'd stopped with the assertion of our particular points of view, and we'd begun to listen and digest what the others were saying. So what I wanted to observe here is the two parts of the brain. As you probably know, the left brain really relishes linear information. It likes planning. It works in a direction. It's very good at achieving results. It's intentional. It's always interested in measurement and planning. Whereas the right brain, and we saw this in the book that Miriam referred to earlier, The Mighty Heart in Action. I'll just show you the cover so you get a memory of it. There's a section on right brain intelligence, and the reasons why we make this distinction is because these two parts of the brain complement each other, because the right brain, while the left brain is planning and measuring and making distinct steps in one direction, the right brain sees the whole picture. It's a feeling-oriented part of the brain. It picks up currents, sometimes subterranean currents in a conversation. It detects what is needed. And there's many, many other qualities of the right brain, but I just want to give you that feeling that there's this, the way I see it, the left brain is going like that, and the right brain is like the whole picture. And I find this is helpful because it doesn't genderize the issue, but it also enables both genders and all genders indeed, to make use of those and to distinguish those two different parts of how we think and how we plan. And it also acknowledges the role of the heart. As much of our lives today are absorbed with thinking, with the brain, with our devices, with minute to minute things happening and having to cope with things minute to minute. But what the heart does is listens to what's going on and feels. And so what we're doing in the courses we run, called The Mighty Heart, is to enable people to develop their capacity to listen, their capacity to use their anger as a vehicle for change. Not, when we spurt out our anger on another person, it can do terrible damage. But if we keep our anger as an energy like fuel and put it in our engine, it enables us to have the resources to keep going to bring about change. So I would say that it's helpful if it helps you, and I'd be interested to know whether it helps you, is to make that distinction between the different parts of the brain and know that the part of our brain that says, I know this, and has a certain air of certainty and security and the relevance and usefulness of a concept and why this is important. It's the response that the heart gives, the right brain gives, is, how is this being heard? What is the exchange going on here? What can be added in terms of understanding and compassion through this conversation? So that's one of the reasons, well, it's one of the things that I've gained from these 6 or 7 years thinking about FemmeQ, working with Karen and with others as the ideas have developed. And I'll just conclude this section by saying that I have come to the conclusion that right brain intelligence is what is going to ultimately save the future for the human race, because it's right brain intelligence that acknowledges the climate crisis in our bones. It gets it. It's this right brain intelligence that cannot bear the awful destruction of the war that's going on at the moment and feels, I must do something about it. I must enable refugees to recover, to get over their trauma. It's the right brain that really pays attention to what the future's like, is going to be like for our children. And it's the right brain that sees the overall picture of what's happening to our planet and does something about it with the help of the left brain. So I believe that if we want to have a future, and if we want to save the beauty of our exquisite planet, it's probably the right brain that's going to play the biggest role. I think that's where the energy is. And I'd love to know how this lands with you, what you feel, because I know Karen has quite a bit to tell us. Oh, thank you, Karen, for the pictures. Karen kindly chose these pictures to show that the masculine, the male, is as good at putting the right brain into action as women are. So here are 3 great examples of the right brain in action. Thanks, Karen.
Great. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. So this is always the great conversation that Scilla and I have, is our differing perspectives, yet we cross over so beautifully. And I want to bring another perspective into the conversation now. So FemmeQ for me is, as I've explored the notion of where intelligence lies, way back during the time that we were developing FemmeQ, I used to say, for a period of time, I was saying to Scilla and Alexandra and Kirsten, our colleagues, I'd listened to a lecture by Rupert Sheldrake. I'm sure many of you know him as a scientist, and he actually said all of the body organs have an intelligence. Every single one, our kidney, our liver, they function as a system, as all systems do. And we don't have to think about how they function. They function in a very holistic way, in a rhythmic and cyclic way, responding to one another so that we stay in health. So I went up to him at the end of the lecture and I said, I've got this question, Rupert, and I wonder if you have an answer. He said, what's the question? And I said, if everything has an intelligence, every organ of our body, is there such a thing as womb intelligence? And he paused like I'm pausing now. And he said, yes, I think you're onto something. And I said, so if the intelligence of inside a woman's body, now I'm going to speak about gender, if the intelligence of a woman's body brings life to life, is that not an intelligence? Doesn't it inform us? What does it do? And he said, I think you should do the research. Go forth, young lady, and do the research. So I got on my very inquisitive bike and pedaled along looking for answers to that question. But I want to introduce, and why I'm telling the story is I want to introduce something that I've been experimenting with, experimenting and inquiring. So I'm just going to see, I'm not sure that my screen is sharing. Is my screen sharing? No, 1 second. So I want to introduce, firstly, that this is a very complex subject that we're talking about. Because what I've discovered in speaking about globally in lectures, in webinars, in retreats, in the programs I run, what always comes up is, am I speaking about gender and does this belong to women? And of course, as Scilla just explained and gave beautiful examples of course not. However, there's something that's very complex about all of this that we don't yet understand. Because if we think about science, all of the bodies and anatomies that were studied up until the 70s were on men's bodies. Most of medicine has been developed by men, orientated around their anatomy. Women giving birth in the global south and in many other countries, and now beautifully with doulas, are giving natural birth versus going into a hospital and complying with the obstetrician's rules and the hospital rules and having to give birth in a very unnatural way. So now I'm speaking about gender, but the reason I'm bringing gender in is because we cannot step over it. Of course, we have to have all of these systems operating and fully functional. But the complexity of the subject is that I know I could not speak about feminine intelligence in a village in India. That is a very privileged conversation. I would be speaking about gender, the rights of women, the protection of women against domestic violence, rape, abuse, and child marriages. That has got nothing to do with feminine intelligence. That's just got to do with human rights. So I want to offer you that when you're having this conversation, wherever you're having it, please make sure that you know the context you're speaking into. Because as Scilla just said, in a decision-making table, when Scilla has to sit around with people that are choosing to make decisions that affect our future, then the right brain is critical. But the thing that I've come to understand through the studies I've done is that the right brain also operates in imagery and imagination. And it uses the left brain to try to explain what it's feeling, sensing, and imagining. We don't have a language yet, I don't think, that can actually describe. We can imagine, but we don't have the language yet to fully articulate what is being felt in our bodies what is being known in our imagination and experienced through inspiration and desire and yearnings for a future. And then we try and put it through the left brain, which is, as Scilla said, rational and dominant and more masculine, if we look at it through that lens. So I want to present this as for everyone to start inquiring and taking rid of, because it is complex. Our biologies are different. And as I said to someone recently, a man that was sitting with me, and he's so in touch with my friends. What does that mean to you? Very empathetic. I said, well, let me ask you something. We both see the moon. We see it waxing and waning. He said, yes. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so I can see you. We see it waxing and waning. But the thing that is different is that for 4 decades, my body operated in a cycle with the moon. That's an intelligence that my system has. Now, I'm not saying it's better, it's just different. So I have a knowing and a deep, profound respect and regard and association to our bodies and to, as someone's just put in, to water and the flow and rhythm. And the menstrual cycle, if we think about the woman's body, the uterus and the umbilical cord is used for stem cells. So I do want to get into the science and understand the feminine, as well as the goddess and the mythology and all of those other facets to it. But I don't think we've taken enough time to really look for ourselves what the feminine means to us. I know that there's a medical term now for when a woman is pregnant. It's called maternal fetal microchimerism. And what happens is, during the time a woman is pregnant, the cells exchange between the fetus and the mother. And the baby, the fetus, feeds up to the mother's heart and vice versa. And that's when the body is needing something. The baby sends messages, the fetus sends messages, and the mother has craving, and it fulfills a need. That's an intelligence. That's an amazing intelligence of the human body, of the human form of women. So I do speak about women, and I do speak about feminine, not that feminine intelligence belongs to women, but there is something going on in women's bodies that produces life. We all came from a woman's body. When a baby is born, it's when often people say it's when heaven meets earth. These are very, very important qualities that we should not let go of, that we should not forget to name. And this system, going back to the pregnant woman, after the woman gives birth, the science now tells us for decades after the baby has been born, the woman literally feels those cells in her body. They're literally in there, in her blood and in her bones. Those of you that are mothers on the call, who's ever felt something intuitively and gone to ring your child and say, there's something wrong? I know I've done it a million times myself. That's an intelligence. So I think we have to keep exploring together and profoundly respect that there is a difference, and that we do have these qualities of compassion and empathy and using, as Scilla said so explicitly, the right brain to solve some of our biggest problems. But we also have to listen to our bodies. And I've become so passionate about ecofeminism, which is that started back in the 80s when 1,000 women gathered and saw the correlation between what was possible with what was necessary to build a peaceful, flourishing society was to bring the feminine through, and to look at the examination of how we've treated our Mother Earth is how we've treated women's bodies. And there's the perfect correlation to what we've done with both objectifying, and often here in Costa Rica, I've heard so many stories and been witness to the situations of domestic violence. And my colleagues are saying, yes, we empower women. And I said, but how do we empower women when they're beaten, when they speak out? You can't have both. So I think there are the women's issues, there are the gender issues. And as I had up on the screen, I think this is the inquiry that I really want to encourage everyone to take research and make their own decisions on, because there is our biology. 1 second, I'm just going to pull this up. There's our biology, our physiology, our somatic intelligence, where our body informs us through our emotional system in relation to the world, our sensorial intelligence. Rudolf Steiner said that the organ of smell was the organ of intuition. How do we navigate and make sense of our world without our senses? So I think absolutely, I'm with Scilla 100% about right intelligence, but I think we haven't got the language yet for the right brain to come strongly through and talk about what it means. And I know how often I stumble and want to say something that makes sense to someone because it's what I feel. Who's ever had that experience? You feel it, but you haven't got the words for it. You know it, but how do I articulate it? How do I explain it? Do I explain it because I need a man to hear it, or I need it to make sense from the left brain? So I think we are practicing. So one of the principles that you asked about earlier, Miriam, for me, is the practice of generosity, of listening to another's point of view, seeing how it fits for our own truth, if it is true for us and it is related to my own personal experiences of the truth, and act in the world according to what matters. And then the final one on the slide there is the three brains, and the gut and the heart, with the millions of neurons that are feeding through to the brain, and our gut intelligence. So all of our system has this amazing intelligence. But I do think I do believe wholeheartedly, we cannot address the climate change, the climate challenge, and the crisis we're facing unless we address what we have done to women, what we need to cultivate as feminine, the feminine principles and feminine intelligence as we go forward. So an impassioned speech, but that's, having been out in the world and doing auxiliaries constantly, I'm not going to be backward in coming forward, talking about the feminine and the power of our bodies and the power of the women's intuition and the care. But it doesn't negate, I don't want that to negate the men, because it doesn't. It's just simply that for decades, centuries, as Anne Baring, as dear friend of Scilla's, has spoken about as a Jungian psychologist and practitioner of the feminine, we know that it is time to restore integrity to the system. So I don't speak about bringing balance. I talk about bringing integrity to the system. And I mean integrity not like morality, but if something is not working, like a pipeline in an engineering term, if the pipe has got a crack in it, then it's out of integrity. It's not functioning as it should function. And I feel that we have become so orientated to the left brain, to the masculine domination and the way that we have operated, that we've adapted so strongly that we need to restore integrity, which is why I want to bring feminine back into the system so that men can say, yes, I fully, wholly embrace all of those parts of me that are tender and soft and caring and passionate, and fully embrace the whole system that we are, not the one that's dominated us for so long. So I'm going to pause there. So what I think would be a good opportunity after listening to Scilla and I is if we take a moment and digest, and if we can go out into another breakout room.
What I'd love to add into this is the fact that in the work that I do, in the Business Plan for Peace and the Mighty Heart, what we're observing is that whereas our leaders particularly in my country, but certainly in Russia and in America and in many other countries, our leaders are floundering. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to stop the war. They don't know how to deal with the impending famine that's going to result from the war if we don't look out. They don't know how to deal with climate change. They don't know how to engage people, even if they wanted to. But what's happening at the other end of the spectrum is that at the grassroots, what we're noticing is all sorts of initiatives sprouting up rather like green shoots coming through concrete, where people in their communities are developing brilliant ideas about how to make the future work better. And they're doing it. The thing is that many of them are not noticed. Very few of them are funded to become more wider and more influential. And so things like SDG 16, the UN Sustainable Development Goal 16, which is for peace, is the least funded of all the SDGs. And even that is tiny compared to the sums of money that crash around the financial markets every day. So I think what we're talking about when we talk about men and women combining their left brain clarity, determination, intention with the right brain seeing the whole picture and feeling what needs to happen and doing the inner work that somebody just mentioned just now. It's vital. What we find is that those who are most powerful in bringing about change in the world, particularly at grassroots, are the ones who've done what I would call the inner work. Somebody just now mentioned a daily meditation practice in whatever way you like to do it. A daily self-awareness so that we don't just crash about the world, inflicting our insecurities and our fears and our selfishness on other people. So that growth of all the methodologies of self-awareness, which includes things like dealing with our inner critic. Is there anybody in this, I think there are 50 of us on this call right now, is there anybody who doesn't have an inner critic? Raise your hand if you don't have one. You're a very rare person. I've talked to a lot of audiences and asked them this question, and only once ever did someone raise their hand. So we all have an inner critic, and much of the time it disenables us. I don't know what yours says to you, but mine says to me, I don't know why on earth you think you can go and give that talk tomorrow. You haven't the faintest idea what you're talking about, and you're going to fall flat on your face. And it wakes me up at 3 o'clock in the night with this kind of message. And I got fed up with it. And I decided it was plaguing me for years and years and years and putting me out of action. And so I suddenly sat up one night and I said, I'm not having this anymore. So I put 2 cushions down. I sat on one cushion and I put my inner critic, so to speak, on the other cushion. And I said to it, tell me, why did you wake me up at 3 o'clock in the morning with all these nasty threats? And I literally, you have to physically move yourself over to the other cushion. And I became the inner critic. And it went on ranting at me for a bit. So I came back to my cushion and I said to it, that is not very helpful. You have to be quite tough with your inner critic. And then I said, what do you really want me to know? Because I know that you know something I need to know about my life. Anyway, long story short, I have now, by being tough with my inner critic in that way, in the middle of the night, on my own, I have learned that that inner critic is one of the, he has some of the best notions, the best advice, the best clarity on my next action, what I should be doing. Anyway, I just offer that to you because that's one of the skills of self-knowledge that we offer to people in the Mighty Heart course. And people really, once they get used to it, they have a lot of fun with it. Karen Wooldridge will know this because we've talked about it. But so just to return to this question that that somebody used...
Can I just pick up to give an example of what you're talking about on the slide? I just want to give a picture to it. I think it's important to really land that message that you're emphasizing. The approach that we developed, it's out of Joanna Macy's work, and Scylla's just pointed to it so importantly, is the inner work for your capacity building, especially in this world. The inner work that Scylla's just spoken about, of going deep for self-reflection and grappling with those inner demons or inner critics, but also the direct action, which Scilla and I both advocate, of taking action in the world, finding what you're passionate about, stepping up and stepping out to take action, and changing the system to create a life-sustaining future. So the inner work is critical. All of some of those things that have been mentioned. The direct action, for example, a dear friend of Scylla's, Dia Khan, who's a filmmaker who goes right into the belly of the beast to confront the issues that she wants to document and film and transform. The changing of the system, our colleague Christina Lunds, who does feminine policy and advocates that around the world. So find the message, find the thing that you're most passionate about, that stirs in your belly, that you want to change and make a difference with. So I'm really just underscoring what Scylla's saying, of doing the deep inner work, taking direct action, and taking your stand in the world for the difference that you want to make. Is there anything to add to that?
I think you wanted to talk about catalysts for transformation, Karen?
Yes, I'll just bring these last points in terms of what we're looking at in how do we have an impact with the feminine principles, the right brain intelligence, and how do we bring this into the world, is there's many different expressions of it. So just to catalyze the change that we need, I'm just going to share the screen. There's those that are the entrepreneurs, the warriors, the pathfinders,
Karen,
and the lovers.
Just 1 second. Someone said, can you put that slide up again?
This one?
I think so. Just some. Okay, then you can carry on with the one that you were.
Mm-hmm. So if we're going to produce a transformation, seeing our role, and I know Scilla well enough to know that she operates through all of those. It's not just one expression that she has from being the, and same for me. So you'll notice that there's all of these amazing catalysts for change. And in FemmeQ, what we're now building and what we're seeking support in building is to create a visual app and a pathway forward so that we can actually map what's happening in the world. All of these grassroots movements that are actually making the transformation happen, the ones that Scilla mentioned, from grassroots up. So there'd be a personal app, an ecosystem where we see the system coming alive, and then globally we can measure it. And what we know, sadly, what is valued is what gets measured. So we're wanting to create something that really, I'm going to flip through these, really has a huge impact for our future as we map these initiatives that are going on around the world. And that's what we're up to with FemmeQ, building the retreats, building these environments where people can be transformed and have their step up into their place and their purpose. So just wanted to complete there and then open up the chat for questions, Miriam, to Scilla and I as we finish off.
Thank you. So I think it's time for us to do maybe less than 15 minutes of Q&A. I just want to bring some of the concept ideas that stands with me for now. It's the need of doing this inner work, and I would say the inner work of nurturing the balance between right and left brain. So inner work you talked about. You also talked about the issue that leaders don't know exactly what they're doing or how to address issues. I heard Karen's talk about ecofeminism. I don't know if you can expand a little bit more, Karen. What does that mean for you, ecofeminism, in terms of right brain and the feminine intelligence. But now I'm just bringing some of the ideas and concepts that I heard from you. And from my end, I think what we need the most is to have spaces in which we are mindful on the need to have this balance between right and left brain, and the fact that not enough attention is paid to what happens, or the role of the right brain. So I would like to open the floor to anybody who would like to make a comment, brief, and ask a question. But I thought of asking maybe a man who is in the room, because I think it would be nice. So, Sam, can I cold call on you? If I'm so sorry, it's really a cold call. Would you like to make a comment or ask a question? And then anyone else, if you can raise your hand. Sam?
Well, first of all, a comment, how inspiring this is. And I love the feel and the work. It just seems to go together. And so I guess my question, rather than a comment, is I shared this earlier. Some indigenous elders suggested that it is the feminine voice and the role of women right now that needs to be heard most in the world today. And so I'm curious what the message from the feminine voice might be for our times and for the context of life and the nurturance of life that we find ourselves.
If I can respond with this slide, a friend of mine, Steve Waddell, created this slide, and thank you so much for that comment and the inquiry. A friend of mine had created, his name is Steve Waddell, and he's worked all of his life in the work of transformation, and he had this model. And when I saw it, I said the thing that's missing is the middle piece, and he finally put the middle circle in. I said, what we need are the healers. We need the indigenous wisdom, and we need the feminine to come through in all of us. And if we tap into Mother Earth, she will let us know. She knows what she needs, and we're not listening. So thank you so much for that comment. It is so critical at this time to listen intuitively to our bodies and the body of our Mother Earth. She's crying.
Very much. Thank you.
Scilla, would you like to add anything on that? What would be the message of the feminine?
Oh, I think we need to be very practical here. I think we need things that people can actually do right now, like teaching children to grow vegetables, like organizing a culture, a currency of compassion, so that we reward people who take care of others. We're feeling this through the pandemic. How many people have been devoting their lives to looking after others without any reward, any payment for their time? How do we organize a currency of compassion? There's so many practical ideas that we can bring in. I won't go on
to mention, as we're talking about healing, because my past and my background is as a healer, I'm seeing it is so essential right now. And as an example, Joanna Macy, who I trained with back in 2001, had a call yesterday and held a circle of grief so that people could outpour what they're grieving and their sense of despair. 1,700 people turned up on that call. Now, if that's not an indication of what we need to pour it out into Mother Earth, to pour it out and then move on, as Scilla said, and then to take action. But we can't sit in our grief. We haven't got time. So it's do our healing, do the grieving, and to take the next step forward. Have that courageous step forward. Is there any other hands up before we close? So Miriam, maybe how it might be best. Yes?
Susan raised her hand.
Please.
Before we close.
Thanks.
Well, I was just typing in the chat that educating girls in developing countries, educated women raise educated daughters and educated sons. And one organization my husband and I support is Plan Canada's Because I Am a Girl project that educates young girls in developing countries. And I think those are important initiatives to highlight sometimes, that there is very good work going on around the world. And so I just wanted to add that.
Susan, thank you. And colleagues who work in India and they educate girls are now turning the table and they say, we don't need to educate the girls. We need to educate the girls in literacy. We need to educate the boys in how to treat the girls. So Miriam, maybe if I just type in the connections that people can make, I'll put it into the chat to close out. If people want to get in touch with the Mighty Heart and Scylla's program that she's running and continues to run with her team, and the FemmeQ, if you want to be part of our community and the community that we're building, please, I've just popped, sorry, I haven't popped it into everyone, I popped it to Miriam. One second.
And while you do that, maybe I should ask Scilla and you, Karen, if you want to give any final remarks and messages for us. Scilla?
I feel there's such a richness here, just looking at everybody's faces, female and male faces, and any other genders. It's really inspiring to see you all, and I've enjoyed this conversation. Thank you. There's lots more practical suggestions. Miriam just kindly listed some of the practical suggestions that I made, but in the book that I showed you earlier, there's 2 or 3 pages of examples of what we can actually do tomorrow to make a safer future, to help build a safer future. So thank you.
And my final words, because we didn't extend on the conversation, but the feminism that I spoke of, Miriam, really was building about a safer world. I'm just going to read an extract out from, so in both ecofeminist history and the ecofeminist political activism, ecology and peace have been inextricably linked since the first explicit feminist, ecofeminist political gathering. It is a branch that makes the connection between women and nature and men and all genders. And it is about creating a flourishing future for all of us, and peace and the ecology and those connections are critical. So thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you for being such a leader for the Earth Charter Institute. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, the 2 of you and everyone, for joining us today. I'm very happy to see you here. We invite you to join any of our next masterclasses in any of the languages, but I would like just to close this by highlighting key words that stands with me from the conversation today, which is creating a flourishing future for all of us, making use of our right brain intelligence and nurturing that, trying to have access and further develop our right brain intelligence. And also actually like to end with the image you shared, Karen, of Mandela, Martin Luther King, and Gandhi as images of male who had a very strong right brain intelligence developed as something that for me it inspired me today. So thank you everyone, and see you soon. I hope you stay well. And a special thanks, of course, for Scilla and Karen for joining us today for this masterclass. Take care. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.